that's located on your own camera. So let's break it down and let's have a look at the back of our cameras first of all. So here we've got the back of a DSLR. Now, as I said, this is pretty standard. So while it might look slightly different from your own camera, all the buttons and the features are going to be available there. They just might be rearranged. But the very first thing to have a look at is our LCD, our liquid crystal display. Our LCD, so if you've ever wondered what that means, liquid crystal display, this is obviously where we can view back our photographs, where we can compose our photographs and find lots of other information out about our cameras, like for example the settings that we're using at any given time. Then we have our menu, so we use the menu button to access all the different settings that are available to us in our cameras. So we can change things like the resolution that the camera captures in, we can change the file types that the camera captures in, so whether we want to capture in JPEG, whether we want to capture in RAW. There's an awful lot to dig into the menu, so be sure to explore that in your own time. Then we have our viewfinder. Not every camera has a viewfinder. Some cameras remove the viewfinder and just rely solely on the LCD. This is used to compose our photographs. We'll also find the light meter in the viewfinder as well, which is a very important tool. We'll also see that on the LCD too. But you know, I personally prefer using the viewfinder just because I'm used to using it, but it's just another option, another way that you can compose your shots. If you are using the viewfinder, we also have this little dial beside it with a plus and minus called the diopter. So if you wear glasses, like me, although I never wear my glasses when I'm supposed to, but you can actually adjust it for your own eyesight. So the little plus and the little minus there to adjust when you need to. So obviously, you know, you're going to have to change that if you're short-sighted or long-sighted. Our playback, so you can review your photographs, you can have a look at the shots you've taken. Information, so info. So when you're in the playback option, if you click the info, it'll give you things like a histogram. It'll give you the settings that were used to capture the photograph. So lots of important information there. We have our adjustment dial, so we can navigate the menus using the adjustment dial, or we can also change camera settings using this dial as well. We can also delete photographs, obviously with the little trash can. And I say use sparingly, and this is important. We're really quick to delete photographs, and in the past, if we shot on film, we couldn't get rid of those photos quite so easily. And sometimes we take a shot and we might feel a little bit indifferent about it. We might feel a little bit unsure about that shot. If you ever feel like that about a photograph, don't delete it, because you may feel differently about it later on. Time has an effect on how we feel about our shots, so don't delete photographs. In fact, I recommend not deleting them until they're on your computer. Then you might delete them, but otherwise, unless you're really struggling for space on your memory cards, I don't think you should delete photographs in camera at all. And finally then, on the back, we have our zoom controls, so we can zoom in and out on photographs. This is also important to zoom in because you want to make sure your photographs are sharp. So you don't want any nasty surprises when you've taken your photographs, you upload them onto your computer, you put them into Lightroom and you zoom in and you see everything is soft. So make sure to zoom in on your photographs as well, just to make sure everything is nice and sharp too. Very important. Looking at the top of the camera, let's have a look at some of the modes and the buttons and the dials here. So the first thing to have a look at is this attachment. Not every camera has them, but DSLRs and mirrorless cameras certainly will, and this is a hot shoe. And this is basically to attach external flash units. It's called a hot shoe because there is an active current that goes through it when we have an external flash unit attached to it. There is also something known as a cold shoe, which is the same shape, but there's no active current that goes through that. Now we can also actually attach things like lights and microphones to the top of this as well, but typically used for attaching a flash to it. Then we have our microphone. This is for sound during video, for capturing sound during video, and for playing it back as well. We have our pop-up flash, so some cameras will have a built-in pop-up flash for adding an extra little bit of light when we need it. We also have our detachable lens. In this particular case, our DX. This is our DSLR lens. We're going to talk about this a lot more in detail in the next lesson. Our on and off switch, some cameras have it on the back instead. Here it's located on the top. We have a very important button, perhaps the most important button, which is our exposure, our shutter release button, and this is the one that we use to take our photograph. We also press it halfway in, press it lightly to focus the scene, so lightly press it to focus the shot. Record button to quickly record video. Now we don't talk about video on this course, so that we've a separate course for that altogether, because it is its own thing, it's its own area. But if you want to take video quickly on your cameras, you just press the record button there. We have an exposure compensation button. I won't go into detail about this now. It is an important button, but we'll talk about that all the way in lesson number 7. And then finally we have our mode dial, so we can quickly change the different modes that we want to photograph in by rotating this dial. And lastly then, just turning the camera to its side. If we have a closer look at the lens, many lenses will have this option called an image stabilizer, which on a Nikon is known as vibration reduction, and this basically helps to reduce camera shake when your hand holding the camera. Many cameras actually have this built in as well, and we'll speak about that more in the next lesson. But have a look at your lenses to see if you have a switch. It might be IS, it might be VR, or some variation of that allows you to switch that on and off. We have our auto manual focus, so many cameras will allow you to change the auto or manual focus on the body or on the lens as well. Now, very important to understand, for photographing in an automatic mode, we can still use manual focus. So the mode that we choose on the camera to capture our photographs, whether it's like automatic mode or manual mode, doesn't correspond with our focusing modes. They can be separate, they are separate. There's a distinction to make there. A lens release, so we have a button here when we need to press in if we want to take the lens off the camera. We have a flash release, so we can press this button to pop up the flash. Very often if we're photographing in automatic, it's going to do this anyway, but if you need to add an extra little bit of light, you can activate that pop-up flash manually by pressing that button. We have a function button. FN is function, which means you can change the function of that button. You can manually choose what feature you want to add quickly to that, and many cameras will have up to 5 function buttons that you can choose to assign whatever feature you prefer. We also have external inputs then here as well. We can attach accessories like microphones, cable releases, and we can also connect it to our television and so on. And finally then we have our timer cable remote release. So this is just a button. We can also access this through the menu as well, which changes how we capture our photographs. So we can have continuous, which where we hold the button down and it just fires off multiple photographs at once. We've got a self timer, so if we need to delay the shutter release, we can choose that, and we can also choose this button if we attach a cable release. All these things we'll speak about as we continue on throughout the lesson. But I hope that's given you a decent insight into all of the buttons and all of the features that are available readily to us on the surface of the camera. All of these, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about in due time as they come up throughout the course. But let's have a look at how our camera actually works. So in the first lesson, I spoke about how our exposure is based on 3 principles, which is light, time, and sensitivity. Light, time, and sensitivity. So how does that work in our camera? Well, if you're anything of a historian or an artist, you've probably come across what's called a camera obscura. Camera obscura has been around for centuries, for a very, very, very long time. Long before we were able to record photographs, camera obscura existed, and was actually also used back in Renaissance times as well. Certainly Dutch painters also used them as well to help when painting their subjects. The basic idea of a camera obscura is that we have a black box, and there's a very small opening in the box, and what happens when light passes through this, it actually projects whatever is on the outside to the inside, but it's upside down and it's reversed. this is also actually how we see. Our eyes actually operate in a very, very similar way. We receive images upside down, but our brain flip everything up the right side. Okay, so there's a little bit of a fact for you. But basically, this is how physics of light works. When it's passed through this small hole, it's actually projected on the other side, upside down and back to front. Now, camera obscuras were used throughout history, as I mentioned, for painting, but they were also used by architects and by mathematicians as well. So they would point the camera obscura, similar to this one here, at something, in this case the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and it would project the image onto a piece of glass, and they were able to then draw that image based on that reflection. So it was used to document things like historical images like this, like paintings, like anything mathematical as well, through this basically manual recording onto paper or with paint. Now, that is how our cameras basically work. The big advance was that we were able to record images onto light-sensitive material. This is where photography was born. So to give you the briefest history of photography that you'll ever come across. So, first of all, light-sensitive materials were discovered in around the 1700s, but it wasn't until around 1826, 1827 that Niels Niesp, difficult one to pronounce, produced this photograph, the view from the window at Le Gras, using a camera obscura with light sensitive material. Then we have Laycock Abbey in 1835, produced by Fox Talbot, which is a prototype for a negative, but it was actually Louis Daguerre in 1839 with the Boulevard du Temple, which was officially recorded as the invention of photography. He actually collaborated with Niels Niesp in developing his camera, but Niesp was unfortunately gone by the time that photograph was taken, and the daguerreotype then determined the photographs for the next couple of decades after that, and studio photographers dominated. So photography wasn't really something that was available to the masses until 1900, when we photography came from right up till the modern era. So what happens then when we actually take a photograph? What happens when we click that shutter button? So let's have a look at our exposure triangle again. So going back to lesson 1, we had a look at light, time and sensitivity, how they all came together to create our exposure. So when we press the exposure button, the first thing that happens is that light enters through the lens via our aperture. So our lens opening. So the amount of light that enters through is controlled by our aperture settings. That's going to be lesson number 6. Light is recorded for a certain amount of time via shutter speed. So shutter speed controls for how long light enters the camera. Okay, and that's lesson number 5. And then finally, light is recorded onto the film or camera sensor to make our photograph. So light and time are the two most important elements, but sensitivity is also important as well. I would call it a tertiary setting. It would be the third thing that we need to consider, but primarily we should be looking at our aperture and our shutter speed to get the correct exposure. we're going to build up to using aperture and shutter speed and ISO all together to create this balanced exposure. This is what fully manual mode is all about. Before we do that though, we need to learn how these work individually, and it is possible to use these settings on their own via our cameras. But let's have a look at how our DSLR captures a photograph and records light onto an image sensor. So here we have our side view of a camera again. Let's cut this in half. Let's chop this camera in half and have a look at the insides. So here's a very basic diagram of what's on the inside of a DSLR. First we have our light entering the lens. So light enters through the lens, it passes through our apertures, so we choose how much light enters through the lens by controlling the aperture. And when we're looking through a DSLR, light is bounced off the mirror of our DSLR and it bounces around a very unusual looking device called a pentaprism, and it comes out the viewfinder, and this is what allows us to see the photograph. So in a DSLR has a mirror inside of it, and if you ever take off your lens you'll actually see the mirror, and basically light enters through the lens, bounces off the mirror, bounces all around the pentaprism, and it allows us to see the photograph. Located behind the mirror is our film or our image sensor. So behind the mirror we have our shutter and our film and our image sensor. Now, very important to note, only DSLRs or film cameras have mirrors and pentaprisms. These do not have any effect on the photograph. It only enables us to actually see the shot. As we saw, if we were to do this using no mirror, the image would be upside down and back to front. And if you use a large format camera, that's exactly how you see the photograph. There's no mirrors in a large format camera, so everything's upside down and back to front. But on our DSLRs, our modern DSLRs, our film cameras, we see the image projected the right way up because of the mirror and the pentaprism. They don't have any effect on the photograph whatsoever. Now, when we press our exposure button, what happens is that the mirror moves out of the way, the mirror lifts up and the shutter opens, and this allows the light to hit the image sensor, and it's recorded onto the image sensor for the duration of time set by the shutter speed. So DSLR is digital single lens reflex. The digital simply stands for digital because it's a digital camera, but the single lens reflex part refers to this action of the light entering through the lens, the mirror moving up out of the way, and the reflex action of the image being captured and the mirror dropping back down when the image is finished recording. Now think about this, when you take a photograph, if you're using a DSLR, what happens when you take a photograph? For a split second that you're taking that shot, what happens when you're looking through the viewfinder? So I want you to type that into Morpheus. Now, if you haven't got a DSLR, don't worry about it. But if you have a DSLR and you take a photograph, what happens in that split second that you take the shot? Okay, so if you said that the image goes black, you're 100% right. And the reason that the image goes black for a split second is because the mirror has moved out of the way. So light is not being reflected off the mirror anymore. It's had to move out of the way to allow the light to pass through to hit the image sensor. Now, if we're using a bridge camera, a smartphone, a mirrorless camera, anything like that that doesn't have a pentaprism or a mirror inside it, the process is a lot more straightforward. Light enters through the lens. When we take the photograph, the shutter simply moves out of the way and allows light to be passed onto the image sensor to record the image. Now, in our smartphones, there's no shutter as such. There's no shutter curtain. It just the image sensor simply activates for the amount of time that we choose, or that the camera chooses itself, to record the image. And fundamentally, that's how it all works. So it's this combination of the aperture allowing a certain volume of light to pass through, and the shutter speed controlling how much time the light is recorded onto the camera's sensor. And fundamentally, that's how we get our photographs. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than just that. Now, just a very quick note on sensor size. So, sensor size can be a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it right now. But basically, there are lots of different types of cameras out there, as we have seen, and they all work on the same principles. Light controlled by the aperture, and time controlled by shutter speed. Where the difference in quality comes from, it comes from a combination of the lenses that are attached to the camera, and it also comes from the size of the image sensor, and indeed the quality of the image sensor as well. There are lots of different sized image sensors. So the image sensor is simply the size of the chip that records the photograph. Now, the largest ones available at the moment are medium format image sensors. So they'd be found in cameras like Hasselblad cameras. Fujifilm have a range of medium format as well. These are very expensive cameras though, and I mean you're talking $5,000 upwards, in some cases all the way up to 40,000, depending on the camera. So these are very much out of range for the majority of people. Full frame cameras, these are 35mm sensors. Now that means 35mm across, going from the diagonal. This would be considered the standard because it was the standard film size. 35mm film, 35mm sensor. This is considered full frame. Then we've got APS-C sensors. These are in kind of more entry-level cameras. They're in some mirrorless sized cameras as well. There's a slightly smaller sensor. So the image quality not quite up there with a full frame, but you'd be hard pushed in this day and age to see the difference, to be 100% honest. Then we've got ones that are known as micro four thirds. These are even a smaller sensor size. So these would be found in cameras like this one here, the Olympus, which I actually have one of those myself. Great little camera. Then we've got 1-inch sensors, found a lot in a lot of compact cameras, and then we've kind of got our smartphone sized sensors. So if you're wondering why there's a difference in quality when the fundamental principles are the same, it's light and time, it's down to the quality of the lens, and it's down to your image sensor size. It's not anything to get hung up on at the moment, because we are going to be talking about it a lot more. Like, the technology just keeps getting better and better and better. There's a lot more being fitted onto these smaller imaging sensors that it's actually getting hard to tell what type of camera certain images were taken on. But we will certainly come back to that when the time is right. Let's move on to the last portion of this lesson and have a look at choosing the right mode for the right scenario when we're out there photographing. So the first thing to talk about is, of course, our mode dial. So most cameras will have some type of mode dial located on the top of the camera for quick access to the different camera modes. Now, not all cameras are designed the same, so it may not be on the top of your camera. It might be actually something located in the menu. Do have a look, because a lot of cameras will remove a lot of buttons and put them in the menu instead to make cameras smaller and more compact. But generally, the most kind of frequently used modes are going to be found on the mode dial, and it's a good idea to have your camera manual handy as well when you're learning about all these different new modes. But the first one to talk about is, of course, the old reliable auto mode. So the automatic mode, great for everyday photography, but this is the mode that we want to get away from as well, because there's a big disadvantage with using auto mode, and that's how we have no control whatsoever. So let's have a look at auto mode. It's great, as I mentioned, it's convenient for pick up and go. You want to start enjoying your photography straight away, you want to start taking pictures straight away, simply switch the mode to auto. Now, it aims to get the correct exposure every time, so all it knows is that it wants to get the right amount of light into the camera to make sure that the picture looks good. It does not know anything about your creative ideas about a shot, whether you want to control the motion using shutter speed, whether you want to have a nice shallow depth of field using aperture. It doesn't know anything about this. It just wants to get the right exposure, so we sacrifice control using auto mode. But it is a good fallback. If you're under pressure, you have to get the shot just snap a few away on auto just to cover yourself. Anyone can use it, so it's great for just passing over to family members or friends. If they just want a quick go in your camera, pop it on auto, but you have no control over exposure at all. You just have no control at all when you're photographing in auto, no creative control, and it's not good for low light photography as well. It just struggles so much in low light images. Usually it'll just pop up the flash because, as I said, all it does, it wants to get the right shot. Moving away from auto, we have a more advanced auto function called program mode. And this is a stepping stone to more control. And the way I would kind of consider program mode, it's almost like the professional's automatic mode. Okay, so it's a semi-auto mode. This means that some settings can be changed. So we have a little bit of control when photographing in program mode. Calculates the best shutter and aperture combination for the scene, okay, but we can adjust one part of the exposure. So for example, if I'm photographing in program mode and I decide that I want a shallower depth of field, I can still adjust my aperture in program mode, but it will control the rest of the exposure. It'll control the ISO and it'll control the shutter speed settings to make sure that I still get the correct exposure. So I can adjust things like my shutter speed and my aperture, but the camera will always control one or the other of the settings. But it is a stepping stone to full control. It'll help you to get familiar with making some changes to the aperture and changes to the shutter speed, just to see the different effects that you can get. And as I mentioned, I consider it auto mode for professionals. A lot of professionals will actually just photograph in program mode and make minor adjustments as needs be, as they're photographing using the aperture and the shutter speed. But it is confusing for beginners. So if you're not familiar with aperture, if you're not familiar with shutter speed, if you're not familiar with ISO and so on, this mode is still going to be quite a confusing mode to use. But by the end of this module, you'll be able to use it no problem. Next, we have our shutter priority. So this will allow you to just control shutter speed. Okay, so switching the dial to the S option, this is shutter priority. And this is another semi-automatic mode. Now sometimes it'll appear as TV depending on the camera you're using. That stands for time value. So shutter priority or time value, it's the same thing. And this will allow you to control the shutter speed, so you can choose the amount of time that the shutter opens and closes for. This is a great mode to use to learn all about your different shutter speeds, because the camera will control the rest of the exposure for you to make sure that you still get the right amount of light in the scene. Now it has its limitations. If you set a shutter speed that's way too long, like 10 seconds, you're probably going to come out with a photograph that's completely overexposed, depending on the light. We'll speak about that in a later lesson. But it's still a great way to learn all about your different shutter speeds. And controlling shutter speed allows for motion and movement to be either frozen or to be blurred. We select very fast shutter speeds to freeze motion, or we select very slow shutter speeds to blur motion. So it's great to experiment, and I really want you to do that after this lesson. Set your camera to shutter priority and start experimenting with the different shutter speeds. Now, control is still limited. So, you still don't have control over your aperture, you still don't really have control over your ISO, you only have control over the shutter speed, and the camera controls the rest. And do be careful of camera shake. You're going to very quickly come across camera shake if you set a shutter speed that is too slow. So you might want to use a tripod if available when using this mode. As well as our shutter priority, we also have aperture priority, and very similar to shutter priority, aperture priority allows us to control only the aperture while the camera controls the rest. So aperture priority, another semi-auto mode, it may appear as AV depending on your camera aperture value, and you can change the aperture, the lens opening size. So basically the aperture is located in the lens. It's not located in the camera. The aperture is located in the lens, and you can control the size of the opening using aperture priority. Now aperture controls depth of field. The camera will control the rest of the exposure, but controlling aperture controls the depth of field in the scene. And this, as I mentioned, similar to shutter speed, it's a great way to learn apertures and see depth of field in action. So depth of field basically is this effect where we can see a certain amount of the photograph being in focus and the background might be blurry. You see it very, very frequently used in macro photography and in portrait photography. Lesson number 6, we'll speak all about it in great detail, but it's a good way to get familiar with it. Do be aware though, aperture selections, so basically the size of the aperture opening is limited by the lens, and we'll speak about that in the next lesson. But not all lenses are created equal. There's different aperture sizes depending on the lens that you are using, and for this reason apertures can be very difficult to understand at the start. I find them a lot more difficult to understand compared to shutter speeds. There's a certain logic to shutter speeds because it's measured by fractions of a second, but apertures are a little bit more complicated than that. But no need to get too hung up on it right now. And finally then we have our Holy Grail, our full manual mode, our complete control option. And basically fully manual mode, the M mode, this is full control. The camera makes no decisions. We have to make all of decisions. You control the shutter speed, you control the aperture, you control the ISO. You've got complete control technically and creatively. You make all the technical decisions about your photograph, you make all the creative decisions about what you want to capture, and you have to find the balance between the two. And this is the challenge of photography. It requires knowledge to use. Sure, that's why you're doing this course. This is exactly what we're going to use by the end of this course. And for that reason, it's the most satisfying mode to use. It's the one that you're going to feel the best about using because you know exactly what you're doing by the time you get to using this mode. Now, just a couple of other common modes for you to be aware of. These are ones I always get asked questions about, but they're really not as important as those kind of key modes we just had a look at. Macro modes used for close-ups and for photos of like flowers and insects, anything kind of small or anything like that. And basically when you switch your camera to this mode, it'll try to give you the best combination of settings to get that little bit closer when photographing smaller objects, but it's not really what we would call true macro. But it does help if you are photographing smaller objects. It's great if you're photographing food. Sports, so for fast moving subjects, it's great for children because anything that's moving very, very fast, you're setting the camera that'll choose the best settings for anything that's moving really, really fast. So it's a good mode to check out if you're into doing your action and sports photography and for restless children. Portrait mode tries to give you the best settings for portraits by using the shallow depth of field. You won't need this mode when you learn about a aperture priority and learn how to use your apertures. It'll just become redundant. But if you want to take some portraits in the meantime and get that nice shallow depth of field effect, switch your dial to portrait. Similarly with landscape, tries to give you the best settings for landscape using a deep depth of field. DOF is depth of field, but again, learning all about apertures, you're not going to need to use that mode. Some cameras have this great panoramic option. It's also available in the majority of phones as well. It allows you to sweep the camera across to create a panoramic photograph. This is great. This is really, really cool, and we will, at a very advanced level, we'll have a look at how you can create your own panoramics. There's quite a bit of work involved with them, but this is a really, really good option that allows you to just quickly sweep the camera across to create a panoramic shot. We've got night portrait, so if you're photographing at night, trying to get a shot of somebody, but we'll likely just use a flash. In this kind of case, this night portrait option will probably just pop up the flash to get that photograph. Then you've got this kind of creative effects, creative auto. It might change depending on the camera that you're using. Just adds like different effects to your photographs. It's kind of for the Instagram generation, if I'm being honest. It's not very useful, but personally I think it was just added to kind of compete basically with phones and filters and Instagram. So don't think you're going to get much use out of that. And then we've got 1 and C2, which is custom 1 or custom 2 or user 1 or user 2. And depending on the camera, this is very advanced though. These are modes that you can set as desired. They're custom functions, so you can choose what you want to set these dials as. Nothing to worry about at all for right now. So that is the end of this lesson. A lot of information in this lesson. I do hope that you enjoyed it. But let's have a quick look at what we're going to be discussing in the next lesson. And we're going to talk all about our camera's lenses. So just the same way we had a look at the different components that are available to us in our cameras, we're going to look at the exact same thing when it comes to our lenses and demystify all of these numbers that appear on them. And if you ever look at your camera's lens, there's a lot of numbers. So we'll talk all about them. We'll also have a look at different focal lengths and angle of view. So focal length is what's used to measure lenses, and different focal lengths create different angles of view. To simplify it, we're going to be speaking about wide angle lenses to telephoto lenses and everything else in between. And finally then, we'll talk about different types of lenses. So what lens are you going to use and when? I mean, they are literally thousands, probably tens of thousands of lenses. But we'll have a look at the key types of lenses in this lesson too. So be sure to attend that lesson. Now, so at the very start of the lesson, I asked you a question. Which one of these was taken with a smartphone? Now, you might have been waiting throughout this lesson with bated breath to find out the answer. And I'm sorry, but it's a bit of a trick question because both of these were taken with a smartphone. And I wanted to show these photographs to you because as I was talking about sensor size, I kind of realised that it is getting harder and harder to tell, what camera has been used for what purpose. So these photographs were both taken with iPhones. I believe the one with the L cover was taken with an iPhone X, 10X. I'm not sure about the one of Oprah Winfrey there. But it's kind of irrelevant though. They were both taken with smartphones, and it's all just about the use of light in these shots. And these are magazine covers, so don't get hung up on image sensor size, don't get hung up on things like the type of camera that you're using and so on, because these are great examples of how smartphones can actually be used professionally as well. With that, let's have a look at your lesson challenge. So thank you so much everybody who participated in the first challenge in posting up your favorite photographic style. Some really great shots there that everybody posted up. For this lesson though, I'd like you to tell us what camera you're currently using and post an optional photograph from that camera. So if you're using your smartphone, if you're using an iPhone or a Samsung or a Huawei or whatever type of phone you're using, or perhaps you're using a Nikon, a Canon, a Fuji, a Panasonic, a Sony, a Pentax, perhaps you're using an old film camera, perhaps you're lucky enough to be using a Hasselblad. I'd love to see what type of camera you're using at the moment and the type of photograph that you're taking at the moment as well. Facebook.com/Shaw Academy. So, well done on completing lesson number 2, and indeed well done on completing your first week here in photography with Shaw Academy. I do hope that you've enjoyed it. I do hope that you've been inspired, that you've learned a lot, and that your cameras are somewhat demystified. Well, I'll see you all back for lesson number 3, all about our camera's lenses. Until then, take care of yourselves and bye bye.